The woman lying beneath the 12th Street Bridge was still wearing her uniform. That's what struck the person who found her first, not the blood, not the position of her body, not the violence that had clearly taken place, but the uniform. The khaki fabric of the Women's Army Corps, the insignia that marked her as someone serving her country, a soldier, an American patriot, dead on American soil. It was 1943. Young men were dying by the thousands on beaches in the Pacific and in the fields of Europe, fighting a war that would define a generation. But here, in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, a quiet Midwestern city far from any battlefield, a young woman in uniform had been murdered, beaten to death. Left under a bridge like she was nothing. Her name was Naomi Chaney. She was 25 years old, and whoever killed her has never been caught. Now, before we go any further, I want to know something. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city, state, or country in the comments. I'm building something here. A community of people who refuse to let these stories disappear into the shadows. So let me know you're out there. Because what happened to Naomi? It should never have been forgotten, but it was. For 80 years, this case has sat in a filing cabinet somewhere in Sioux Falls, gathering dust. The oldest unsolved murder in the city's history. A woman who volunteered to serve her country during its darkest hour, cut down in the prime of her life, and nobody has ever answered for it. You'd think a case like this, a soldier murdered on home soil during wartime, would have been front-page news. You'd think every resource would have been thrown at finding the killer. You'd think justice would have been swift and certain. And at first, it seemed like it would be. Police identified a suspect. They brought him in. They questioned him. They held him. For a moment, it looked like Naomi's killer would face justice, that her family would get answers, that this nightmare would end. But the evidence wasn't enough. 1,940 seconds. Forensic science couldn't do what we can do today. No DNA testing, no surveillance cameras, no cell phone pings or digital footprints, just witness statements, circumstantial evidence, and a gut feeling that they had the right guy. But gut feelings don't hold up in court, so they couldn't charge him. They had to let him go. And then, the twist that sealed Naomi's fate forever. The suspect went to war. He shipped out to fight overseas, just like so many other young American men in 1943, and he never came home. He was killed in combat. Died on a battlefield thousands of miles away. Whatever he knew, whatever truth he could have told, whatever secrets he carried about that night under the 12th Street Bridge, all of it died with him. If he was guilty, justice would never be served. If he was innocent, the real killer walked free. Either way, Naomi Chaney's murder would remain unsolved. 80 years later, it still is. Think about that for a second. 80 years. That's longer than most of us will live. Longer than our parents have been alive. Longer than rock and roll. Longer than television. Longer than the internet. For 8 decades, this case has sat cold. The people who knew Naomi, her family, her friends, the women she served alongside, they're all gone now. The investigators who worked her case, gone. The witnesses who might have seen something that night, gone. Even the suspect is gone, buried in some military cemetery with full honors. Everyone connected to this case has been dead for years, except Naomi's story. That's still here, still waiting, still demanding answers. Because here's the thing that gets me. The thing that keeps me up at night thinking about cases like this. Naomi Chaney did everything right. She didn't ask to be a victim. She didn't put herself in danger. She wasn't walking through a bad neighborhood at 3 a.m. or living some risky lifestyle. She was walking home from her post. She was serving her country. She was doing her duty, and someone took her life anyway. Then the system failed her. The investigation stalled. The suspect died. The case went cold. And for 80 years, nobody's done a damn thing about it. Until now. Because I'm not letting this story die. I'm not letting Naomi Chaney become just another name in a dusty file cabinet, just another forgotten woman whose life didn't matter enough to remember. Her life mattered, her service mattered, her death mattered, and the fact that her killer was never brought to justice, that matters too. So buckle up, because we're about to dive deep into one of the most frustrating, heartbreaking, and infuriating cold cases in American history. We're going back to 1943. To a country at war, to a small city in South Dakota, and to a young woman who deserved so much better than what she got. This is the story of Naomi Chaney, and it's a story that needs to be told, To understand what happened to Naomi Chaney, you have to understand the world she lived in. And 1943, that was a different America. This wasn't the America of smartphones and social media, of true crime podcasts and 24-hour news cycles. This was an America at war, not some distant conflict we saw on screens, but a war that touched every single household, every single family, every single life. By 1943, World War II had been raging for years. Hitler's armies had swept across Europe. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor, dragging America into a fight nobody wanted but everybody knew had to be won. And the cost? Staggering. Every day, telegrams arrived at homes across the country with news that would shatter families. Your son, your brother, your husband, killed in action. The men were gone. Millions of them. Shipped overseas to fight in places most Americans had never heard of. Guadalcanal, Normandy, Stalingrad, North Africa. They left behind a country that still needed to function, industries that still needed workers, and a military that still needed support. So women stepped up, not because it was easy, not because society welcomed it, but because their country needed them. And they weren't going to sit on the sidelines while the world burned. They went to work in factories, building the planes and tanks and ships that would win the war. They took jobs that had been men's work for generations: welding, riveting, engineering. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a poster. She was millions of real women who rolled up their sleeves and proved they could do anything a man could do. And some of them went even further. They enlisted. In 1942, Congress established the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, which later became the Women's Army Corps, the WAC. For the first time in American history, women could officially serve in the military in roles beyond nursing. They could be clerks, drivers, mechanics, radio operators, and analysts. They could wear the uniform. They could serve their country with the same pride and duty as any man. It was revolutionary. And it was dangerous not because of enemy fire, but because of the attitudes women faced. A lot of people didn't think women belonged in uniform. They faced harassment, skepticism, and outright hostility. Rumors spread about WAC members being promiscuous or unfeminine. Some families disowned daughters who enlisted. Some communities looked down on them, but they served anyway. By 1943, over 150,000 women had joined the Women's Army Corps. They were stationed at bases across the country and overseas. They worked around the clock, doing jobs that freed up men to fight on the front lines. They were patriots in every sense of the word. Naomi Chaney was one of them. She was stationed in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, a city that probably seemed worlds away from the chaos of war. Sioux Falls wasn't a major military hub. It wasn't a coastal city bracing for invasion. It wasn't an industrial powerhouse churning out weapons. It was just a regular Midwestern town, population around 40,000. Quiet streets, church on Sundays, neighbors who knew each other's names, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and kids played outside until the streetlights came on. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and nothing bad ever really happened. Or so they thought. Sioux Falls felt safe. It was supposed to be safe. That's what made it so attractive as a location for military installations during the war. Far from the coasts, far from any potential threats, nestled in the heart of America, where young soldiers could train without fear of attack. The irony is almost unbearable. While American soldiers were dying on foreign soil fighting enemies thousands of miles away, danger was lurking right here at home. In a quiet town, on a quiet street, near a quiet bridge, life in 1943 Sioux Falls was shaped by the war, just like everywhere else in America. Rationing was in full effect. Sugar, coffee, meat, gasoline, rubber, all carefully controlled. Families saved tin cans and grew victory gardens. Kids collected scrap metal for the war effort. Every aspect of daily life was touched by the reality that the nation was fighting for survival. But there was also a sense of duty, of purpose. People weren't just enduring the war. They were contributing to it. Everyone had a role to play, and everyone took that role seriously. Whether it was buying war bonds, volunteering for civil defense, or working extra shifts at the factory, Americans pulled together in a way that's hard to imagine today. Women like Naomi embodied that spirit. Every morning, she'd put on her uniform, a symbol of pride, of service, of breaking barriers. She'd report to the base and do whatever her country asked of her. The work wasn't glamorous. It was often tedious, repetitive, exhausting. But it mattered. Every report filed, every message relayed, every task completed meant one more man could be sent to the front lines, one more step closer to winning the war. And at the end of her shift, Naomi would walk home. It was routine, normal, nothing to worry about. Sioux Falls wasn't a war zone. There were no enemy soldiers, no bombs, no gunfire. The streets were familiar. The people were friendly. And the biggest danger most folks worried about was maybe slipping on ice in the winter. Nobody thought about murder. Why would they? This was America. This was the heartland. This was the kind of place where bad things didn't happen to good people, or at least, that's what everyone believed. But evil doesn't care about your zip code. It doesn't care if you're in a big city or a small town. It doesn't care if you're a soldier or a civilian, and it definitely doesn't care if you're wearing a uniform that represents everything noble and decent about this country. Evil finds a way, and on one night in 1943, it found Naomi Chaney. She was doing exactly what she'd done dozens, maybe hundreds of times before walking home from the base. Same route, same time, same expectation that she'd arrive safely, just like she always did. But she didn't make it home that night. Somewhere along that familiar walk, somewhere near the 12th Street Bridge, someone was waiting. Someone with violence in their heart, someone who saw a young woman in uniform, a woman serving her country, a woman who'd volunteered to defend the freedoms we all take for granted and decided to take her life. While American boys were dying on beaches in the Pacific, while families were sacrificing everything to support the war effort, while the entire nation was united in a common cause, someone in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, committed an act of unspeakable brutality against one of our own. Naomi Chaney survived basic training. She survived the scrutiny and skepticism that came with being a woman in the military. She survived the daily grind of wartime service, but she didn't survive a walk home through her own neighborhood. That's what makes this case so haunting. It's not just that she was murdered, it's that she was murdered here, on American soil, in a place that was supposed to be safe. She wasn't a casualty of war, she was a casualty of something far more insidious, something that lived among the very people she was serving to protect. And, whoever did it, they blended right back into that small-town community. They walked those same streets. They lived that same life. They got away with it. For 80 years. Now let me tell you about the woman whose life was stolen that night. Her full name was Naomi Irene Chaney. Born in 1918, she came into a world that was just emerging from one global war, and had no idea another was coming. She grew up during the Roaring Twenties, survived the Great Depression as a teenager, and came of age in the shadow of a conflict that would reshape everything. By the time she was 25 years old in 1943, Naomi had already lived through more upheaval than most people experience in a lifetime. But she didn't let it break her. She didn't retreat from the world or play it safe. She stepped up. Naomi wasn't from Sioux Falls originally. Like so many young women who joined the Women's Army Corps, she'd left behind her hometown, her family, and everything familiar to serve her country. That takes courage, the kind of courage that doesn't make headlines but should. Think about what that decision meant in 1943. Women didn't just casually join the military back then. It wasn't normalized. It wasn't celebrated by everyone. In fact, it was controversial. There were whispers, judgments, raised eyebrows. Some people questioned the morals of women who enlisted. Others said they were taking jobs away from men. Still others couldn't wrap their heads around the idea that a woman could serve in any capacity beyond nursing or secretarial work. But Naomi didn't care about the gossip. She saw her country in crisis. She saw young men shipping out by the thousands, fighting and dying for freedom. And she asked herself a simple question. What can I do to help? The answer was to enlist. Joining the WAC wasn't glamorous. The pay wasn't great. The work was often unglamorous. Filing paperwork, operating switchboards, managing logistics. You weren't going to be on the front lines. You weren't going to get parades or medals or glory. But you were going to contribute. You were going to matter. You were going to be part of something bigger than yourself. And that's what Naomi wanted. Her family was proud of her. They had to be. In an era when so many families were sending sons off to war, the Cheneys sent their daughter. She wore the uniform with the same pride, took the same oath, and committed herself to the same cause. When Naomi arrived in Sioux Falls, she joined a community of women just like her, young, determined, ready to serve. They came from all over the country, from farms and cities, from wealthy families and working-class backgrounds. What united them was a sense of duty, a belief that their country needed them, and they weren't going to let it down. Life on base wasn't easy, but it had its moments. There was camaraderie among the women. They looked out for each other, shared stories from back home, wrote letters to family, and tried to make the best of a situation none of them had ever imagined being in. They weren't trained soldiers in the traditional sense, but they carried themselves with discipline and pride. Naomi fit right in. By all accounts, she was well liked. She did her job, didn't complain, showed up on time, and carried her weight. In the military, that's all anyone asks of you: do your part, take care of your people, and get the mission done. And Naomi did exactly that. But she wasn't just a name on a roster or a cog in the machine. She was a person. A young woman with hopes and dreams and a future that should have stretched out for decades ahead of her. She had a life outside the uniform. After her shifts, Naomi would walk back to her lodging, a routine she'd done so many times it probably didn't even register as something to think about. Just like you might drive the same route to work every day without giving it a second thought, Naomi walked the same streets, passed the same buildings, crossed the same bridge. It was autopilot. Muscle memory. Safe. Except it wasn't. What makes Naomi's story so heartbreaking is how ordinary she was. And I don't mean that as an insult, I mean it as the highest compliment. She wasn't famous. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't someone whose name you'd recognize. She was just a regular person trying to do the right thing. She could have stayed home. She could have taken a factory job or worked as a clerk or gotten married and started a family. Nobody would have blamed her. Millions of women made those choices, and there's nothing wrong with that. But Naomi wanted more. She wanted to serve. She wanted to be part of the fight, even if her battlefield was a typewriter or a radio or a filing cabinet instead of a foxhole. That's heroism. Not the Hollywood kind with explosions and medals and dramatic speeches. The quiet kind. The everyday kind. The kind that says, my country needs me, and I'm going to answer the call, even if nobody ever knows my name. And for a long time, nobody did know her name. That's the cruelest part. Naomi Chaney gave her country everything. Her time, her energy, her youth, her service, and in return, she got a brutal death and a forgotten cold case. 80 years later, most people in Sioux Falls don't even know who she was. The bridge where she died is still there, but there's no marker, no plaque, no memorial. Life just went on. The city grew. New generations were born. The war ended. The world moved forward, and Naomi got left behind. But here's what I want you to understand. Naomi wasn't just a victim. She was a person. She had favorite songs and favorite foods. She probably wrote letters home telling her family about South Dakota, about the weather, about the people she met. She probably had inside jokes with the other women in her unit. She probably laughed and cried and worried and hoped, just like anyone else. She had a future. Maybe she would have stayed in Sioux Falls after the war. Maybe she would have gone back home. Maybe she would have gotten married, had kids, built a career, lived a long and happy life surrounded by grandchildren who would have heard stories about the time Grandma served in the war. We'll never know. Because someone took that future away from her. Someone looked at this young woman, this patriot, this volunteer, this person trying to do good in a dark world, and decided her life didn't matter, decided that whatever sick impulse was driving them was more important than her right to exist. And then, to add insult to injury, the system failed her. The investigation stalled. The evidence wasn't enough. The suspect walked. Then he died. And Naomi's case went cold, filed away, forgotten. She deserved better. She deserved justice. She deserved a trial. She deserved answers for her family. She deserved to be remembered not just as a murder victim, but as a woman who served her country with honor and dignity. Instead, she became a statistic, a cold case number, a footnote in Sioux Falls history. That ends today, because I'm not letting Naomi Chaney be forgotten anymore. I'm not letting her story fade into the background. And if you're still watching this, I know you feel the same way. You're here because you believe these stories matter. You believe the forgotten deserve to be remembered. You believe that justice, even 80 years late, is still worth fighting for. So here's what I need from you. If this story is hitting you as hard as it's hitting me, if you're angry that Naomi never got justice, if you're heartbroken that her life was stolen, if you believe her story deserves to be heard, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. This channel is dedicated to giving voices to the forgotten, to the victims who didn't get headlines, to the cases that went cold. To the families who never got closure, Naomi Chaney is one of those voices, and with your help, we're going to make sure she's heard. Subscribe, hit the like button, share this video, because the more people who hear Naomi's story, the more pressure there is to reopen this case, to look at it with fresh eyes, to see if modern forensics can finally do what 1,940 seconds technology couldn't. Justice might be delayed, but it doesn't have to be denied forever. All right. You're still with me. That means you're invested. That means you care. Good. Because now we need to talk about the night everything went wrong. The night Naomi Chaney walked home from base for the last time. The night someone was waiting for her near the 12th Street Bridge. The night a hero was murdered on American soil. Let's go back to 1943. Let's walk that route with her. Let's see if we can figure out what the hell happened and why, 80 years later, nobody's been held accountable. It was an ordinary evening in Sioux Falls, the kind of evening that happens 1,000 times over in small-town America. Nothing special, nothing memorable, just another day winding down as the sun set over the flat South Dakota plains. For Naomi Chaney, it was just another shift, ending at the base. She'd done her work, completed her duties, and now it was time to head home. The same walk she'd made countless times before, the same route through the same streets in the same quiet city that had become familiar over the months she'd been stationed there. There was no reason to think this night would be any different from all the others, but it was. Somewhere between the base and where Naomi was staying, someone was waiting, someone with violence in their heart, someone who saw an opportunity in the darkness, and Naomi Chaney would never make it home. Let me paint the picture for you. The 12th Street Bridge wasn't anything remarkable. It wasn't a grand architectural landmark or a major thoroughfare. It was just a bridge, functional, unremarkable, the kind of structure you'd pass without giving it a second thought. It crossed over the Big Sioux River, connecting one part of town to another. During the day, you might see cars crossing it, people walking by, kids playing near the water below. Normal, everyday activity. But at night, that was different. At night, the bridge became isolated, dark, the kind of place where the shadows stretch long and the sounds of the city fade away. Street lighting in 1943 wasn't what it is today, no bright LED lights flooding every corner, just dim bulbs spaced far apart, leaving plenty of darkness in between. The area around the bridge was quiet after dark. Not a lot of foot traffic, not a lot of witnesses. If you were looking for a place to commit a crime and get away with it, this would be a pretty good spot, and someone knew that. We don't know the exact time Naomi left the base that evening. Military records from 1943 aren't complete, and the details that were documented have been lost to time or buried in archives that haven't been digitized. But based on the investigation, we know it was evening late enough that darkness had settled over Sioux Falls. Naomi would have been in uniform, walking with the purposeful stride of someone who'd made this journey dozens of times. Maybe she was tired from her shift. Maybe she was thinking about getting something to eat, writing a letter home, or just getting some rest before another day of duty started. She had no idea what was coming. As she approached the 12th Street Bridge, everything probably seemed normal. The same bridge she'd crossed before. The same dim lighting. The same quiet streets. But someone was there. Whether they'd been waiting specifically for her, or whether she was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, we may never know. What we do know is that the attack was sudden and brutal. Blunt force trauma. That's the cold, clinical term the medical examiner would use. But let's be clear about what that means. Someone beat Naomi Chaney to death. They struck her repeatedly with enough force to kill her. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong where someone panicked and things escalated. This was murder. Violent, deliberate, vicious murder. Naomi was 25 years old, in good physical condition from her military training. She would have fought back. She would have tried to defend herself. But whoever attacked her overpowered her. And in those terrible final moments of her life, Naomi Chaney must have known she was going to die. I can't imagine the terror, can you? Being attacked in the dark, alone, knowing nobody can hear you scream, knowing help isn't coming, knowing this is it, this is how your story ends. Not on a battlefield overseas fighting for your country, but under a bridge in a town that was supposed to be safe. The attack happened fast. It had to. The longer an attack takes, the more chance there is of being seen, of the victim escaping, of something going wrong for the attacker. Whoever did this wanted it done quickly, and when it was over, they left her there, under the bridge, in the darkness. Like she was garbage, a woman in uniform, a soldier, an American patriot, left to die alone. Her body was discovered the next morning. I haven't been able to find detailed records of exactly who found her, or what time, but we know it was shortly after the attack. Someone walking by the bridge, maybe on their way to work, maybe out for a morning stroll, saw something that didn't look right, and when they got closer, they realized what they were looking at. Imagine being that person. Imagine starting your day thinking it's going to be normal, and then stumbling across a murder scene, seeing a young woman's body, still in uniform, clearly the victim of horrific violence. The horror of that discovery must have been overwhelming. Word spread fast. In a town the size of Sioux Falls in 1943, news like this didn't stay quiet. There were no social media alerts, no breaking news notifications on phones. But people talked. They called each other. They knocked on doors. They gathered in the streets. A soldier had been murdered, not overseas, not by enemy forces, right here in Sioux Falls. The shock rippled through the community like an earthquake. People couldn't process it. How could this happen? Who would do something like this? And why? The military base went into immediate lockdown mode. Questions flew. Where was Naomi last seen? Who saw her leave? Did anyone notice anything suspicious? Was she meeting someone? Did she have enemies? The police response was swift. They had to be. A murdered soldier on American soil during wartime? This wasn't just a local crime, this was a national embarrassment. This was the kind of story that could make headlines across the country if it wasn't handled quickly. Detectives descended on the scene. They photographed everything, collected what evidence they could with 1,940 seconds, technology, interviewed anyone who might have seen or heard something. The community was terrified. If this could happen to a soldier, someone trained, disciplined, strong, it could happen to anyone. Mothers kept their daughters home after dark. Women started traveling in groups. Men patrolled neighborhoods looking for anything suspicious. Fear does that. It changes how people live. It makes you look over your shoulder. It makes you question everyone around you. Because here's the thing that makes cases like this so disturbing. The killer was one of them. Someone in Sioux Falls, someone walking those same streets, shopping at the same stores, maybe even attending the same churches, had murdered Naomi Chaney. And they were still out there, blending in, acting normal, pretending they hadn't just committed an unspeakable act. That's what evil does. It hides in plain sight. The outrage was immediate and intense. How dare someone do this to one of our soldiers? How dare someone attack a woman serving her country? This wasn't just murder, it was an attack on everything America stood for. People demanded answers. They demanded justice. They demanded that whoever did this be caught, tried, and punished to the fullest extent of the law. And at first, it looked like that's exactly what would happen. But we'll get to that in a minute. First, I want you to do something for me. What time is it where you are right now? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. I'm serious. I want to know. Because right now, as you're watching this, you're safe. You're in your home, or your car, or wherever you are, and you're okay. You're going to finish this video, and then you're going to go about your day, and you're going to be fine. Naomi Chaney thought she was safe too. She thought she'd walk home, just like she'd done 100 times before. She thought she'd wake up the next morning and put on her uniform and serve her country for another day. She thought she had a future. And in one moment of brutal violence, all of that was stolen from her. That's what murder does. It doesn't just end one life, it destroys the future that person should have had, the family they might have raised, the career they might have built, the grandchildren they might have held. The decades of life they should have lived, all of it gone. Naomi's family got the news shortly after her body was discovered. Imagine that phone call. Imagine being told that your daughter, your sister, your loved one, someone who volunteered to serve her country, someone who was brave enough to break barriers and join the military had been murdered, not in combat, not in an accident. Murdered. The grief must have been unbearable, but mixed with that grief was something else. The expectation that justice would be served, that the police would find who did this, that there would be a trial, a conviction, a punishment, that Naomi's death would mean something. That expectation is what makes what happened next so much worse, because the system failed her. Not immediately at first. It looked like everything was going according to plan. The investigation moved quickly. Police identified a suspect. They brought him in for questioning. For a brief moment, it seemed like Naomi would get justice, but that moment didn't last. What happened next would seal Naomi Cheney's case as unsolved for the next 80 years and counting. The suspect they arrested, he'd never stand trial. The evidence they collected, it wouldn't be enough. The truth about what happened that night under the 12th Street Bridge, it would die with the one person who might have been able to answer for it, and Naomi Cheney would become just another cold case, just another forgotten victim, just another name that nobody remembers, until now, because we're not done yet. Not even close. We're about to dive into the investigation that followed the suspect they identified, the evidence they gathered, and the frustrating, infuriating reasons why nobody was ever charged with Naomi's murder. Stay with me. This is where it gets complicated. The moment Naomi Cheney's body was discovered, the clock started ticking. In any homicide investigation, the first 48 hours are critical. Evidence is freshest. Memories are clearest. Witnesses haven't had time to second-guess what they saw or convince themselves it wasn't important. The trail is hot, and if you're going to solve the case, this is your window. The Sioux Falls Police Department knew that, and they came out swinging. This wasn't just another murder, this was the murder of a soldier during wartime. The pressure was immense. From the military brass at the base, from the mayor's office, from the community, from Naomi's family, and probably from federal authorities who wanted to make damn sure this didn't become a national scandal. A young woman serving her country had been beaten to death on American soil, and somebody was going to answer for it, or so everyone thought. Detectives immediately cordoned off the area around the 12th Street Bridge. They combed through every inch of the scene, looking for anything that might point them toward the killer. In 1943, that meant eyeballing everything, no fancy forensic equipment, no crime scene reconstruction software, no DNA analysis, just good old-fashioned detective work. They looked for footprints in the dirt. They searched for the murder weapon, something heavy enough to cause blunt force trauma. Maybe a rock, a pipe, a piece of wood. They checked for anything the killer might have dropped: a button, a piece of fabric, a personal item. They interviewed anyone who lived near the bridge, anyone who worked nearby, anyone who might have been in the area that evening. Did you see anything? Hear anything? Notice anyone acting strange? It was painstaking, exhausting work. And it was hampered by limitations we can barely comprehend today. Think about how murder investigations work now. Detectives can pull surveillance footage from businesses, traffic cameras, doorbell cameras, ATMs. They can track cell phone pings to place someone at a scene. They can pull DNA from a single hair, a drop of blood, a cigarette butt. They can run fingerprints through national databases in minutes. They can use forensic genealogy to identify suspects through their relatives' DNA, uploaded to ancestry websites. None of that existed in 1943. No security cameras, no cell phones, no DNA testing. Fingerprint analysis was still relatively new and only useful if you already had a suspect to compare against. Blood typing could tell you someone's blood type, but that's not exactly a smoking gun when millions of people share the same type. Everything depended on witnesses, physical evidence you could see with the naked eye, and good old-fashioned legwork. And in this case, the crime happened at night, in a relatively isolated area, during a time when most people were home for the evening. The chances of finding a witness who actually saw the attack? Slim to none. But the detectives pressed on. They built a timeline. When did Naomi leave the base? What route would she have taken? How long should the walk have taken? When was her body discovered? That gave them a window, a time frame when the murder must have occurred. They interviewed the other women in Naomi's unit. Did she mention meeting anyone? Was she involved with anyone romantically? Did she have any disputes with anyone? Any enemies? From what the records suggest, Naomi was well liked. She didn't have beef with anyone. She wasn't involved in any drama. She kept her head down, did her work, and stayed out of trouble. So this wasn't personal. At least, not in the sense that Naomi had somehow brought this on herself or had a history with her killer, which meant one of two things. Either this was random, a crime of opportunity, where Naomi happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, or the killer had targeted her for reasons that weren't obvious. Random crimes are harder to solve. There's no clear connection between victim and perpetrator, no motive that makes sense, no trail to follow, just chaos and bad luck. But investigators didn't think this was random. Why? Because of where it happened. The 12th Street Bridge wasn't a high-traffic area at night. It wasn't a place where someone would just randomly happen to be hanging out. If someone was there after dark, they had a reason to be there. And if someone attacked Naomi there, they either followed her there, or they were waiting for her. That suggests premeditation, planning, intent. This wasn't some spontaneous act of violence. This was deliberate. The community was on edge. People were scared, angry, demanding action. Town hall meetings were held. Citizens organized patrols. Everyone had a theory about who might have done it, and the police were feeling the heat. They needed a break in the case. They needed something, anything, to point them in the right direction. And then, they caught one. Somebody came forward with information. I don't have access to the exact details. Those records are either lost, sealed, or buried in archives that haven't been fully documented online. But based on what's known about the case, police received a tip or uncovered evidence that pointed them toward a specific individual. A man. Someone who had been in the area. Someone who didn't have a solid alibi. Someone whose behavior after the murder raised red flags. The details are murky, and that's part of what makes this case so frustrating. We don't know exactly what evidence led police to this suspect. We don't know if it was witness testimony, physical evidence, or suspicious behavior. But whatever it was enough for detectives to bring him in for questioning. And that's when things got interesting. The suspect was interrogated. For hours, probably. Police in the 1,940 seconds weren't bound by the same rules we have today. No Miranda rights. No mandatory presence of an attorney. No recordings of interrogations to ensure everything was by the book. They could lean on a suspect, hard, and they did. We don't know exactly what the suspect said during those interrogations. Did he deny everything? Did he admit to being near the bridge? Did he offer an alibi that didn't check out? Did he lawyer up? Or did he talk? All we know is that police believed they had their man. They held him, kept him in custody while they tried to build a case strong enough to take to trial. And here's where the limitations of 1,940 seconds forensics came back to bite them. They had suspicions. They had circumstantial evidence. They had reasons to believe this man was involved, but they didn't have proof. Not the kind of proof that would hold up in court. Not the kind of proof that would convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. Think about what they were missing. No DNA evidence linking him to the scene. No murder weapon with his fingerprints on it. No witnesses who actually saw him commit the crime. No confession that was solid enough to stand on its own. Just suspicion. Just a gut feeling. Just a case that looked good on paper but fell apart under scrutiny. And in America, you can't convict someone on suspicion. The prosecutors looked at what the police had gathered and made a devastating decision. They couldn't charge him. The evidence wasn't there. A defense attorney would tear the case apart, and if they went to trial and lost, double jeopardy meant they could never try him again, even if new evidence emerged later. So they made the call. They let him go. Imagine being a detective on that case. You've worked around the clock. You've chased every lead. You've interviewed dozens of people. You've lost sleep thinking about Naomi Chaney lying dead under that bridge. You've looked her family in the eye and promised them you'd find who did this. And then you have to let your prime suspect walk out the door. The frustration must have been crushing. Imagine being Naomi's family. You've been told the police have a suspect. You've been told they're building a case. You've started to believe that justice is coming, that the person who murdered your daughter will face consequences. And then you're told there's not enough evidence, that the suspect is being released, that the case is effectively stalled. The betrayal must have been devastating. Imagine being a member of the Sioux Falls community. You've been terrified, wondering if there's a killer walking among you. Then you hear the police made an arrest, and you breathe a sigh of relief. The monster has been caught, and then you find out he's been let go. The fear comes roaring back, because if he didn't do it, the real killer is still out there. And if he did do it but they couldn't prove it, he's free to do it again. Either way, nobody was safe. The investigation continued, but the momentum was gone. Detectives chased other leads, interviewed more people, re-examined the evidence they had, but nothing stuck. The case started to go cold. Not all at once. Cold cases don't usually freeze overnight. They cool gradually. Days turn into weeks. Weeks turn into months. New crimes demand attention. Resources get pulled elsewhere. The urgency fades. And slowly, inevitably, the case gets filed away. That's what was happening to Naomi Chaney's murder. The community moved on. Because communities have to. People can't live in fear forever. Life has to continue. The war was still raging overseas, and there were bigger things to worry about than one unsolved murder in South Dakota. Naomi's family was left with questions that would never be answered. Who killed their daughter? Why? Would they ever face justice? And the suspect, the man police believed was responsible, he went back to his life. But the war was still going on, and like millions of other young American men in 1943, he was eligible for military service. Whether he enlisted or was drafted, we don't know. But what we do know is that sometime after being released by police, after being questioned about Naomi Cheney's murder, after walking free because the evidence wasn't strong enough, he went to war. He left Sioux Falls, left South Dakota, left the United States, shipped out to fight in Europe or the Pacific alongside thousands of other soldiers, and Naomi Cheney's case sat unsolved, waiting for his return, waiting for the chance to question him again, waiting for new evidence to emerge, waiting for technology to advance enough to prove what investigators believed in their gut. But that chance never came, because he never came home. The suspect, the man who might have been able to answer for what happened to Naomi that night under the 12th Street Bridge, was killed in action. He died on a battlefield thousands of miles away, and with him died any hope of solving Naomi's murder. If he was guilty, he'd escape justice. If he was innocent, the real killer would never be found. Either way, Naomi Cheney's case was now effectively closed. Not solved, just over. And that's where it would stay for the next 80 years. But before we move on, I need to talk to you about something. Real quick, if you haven't already, smash that like button. It helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. Alright, back to the case. Because what happened next is one of the cruelest twists of fate in true crime history. So who was he? Who was the man police believed murdered Naomi Cheney? That's where this case gets even more frustrating, because the historical record is maddeningly incomplete. The suspect's name has been lost to time, or more accurately, buried in records that haven't been fully preserved or digitized. Court documents from 1943 Sioux Falls aren't exactly easy to access, and without a formal charge, there may not even be public records with his identity. What we do know paints a picture that's both compelling and deeply troubling. The suspect was local to the Sioux Falls area. He wasn't some drifter passing through town. He wasn't a stranger who appeared out of nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. He was from there, or at least had been in the area long enough to be known by investigators. That's significant, because it means he knew the area. He knew the 12th Street Bridge. He knew the routes women from the base might take walking home. He knew the dark corners and isolated spots where someone could commit a crime without being seen. He had knowledge. He had opportunity. And police believed he had motive, even if that motive was never made entirely clear. What made investigators zero in on him? That's the million-dollar question. And without access to the original case files, we're left piecing together fragments. But based on how investigations worked in that era, and what typically makes someone a prime suspect, we can make some educated guesses. He was probably in the area the night Naomi was killed. Maybe someone saw him near the bridge. Maybe he was known to frequent that area. Maybe he couldn't account for his whereabouts during the time frame when the murder occurred. Alibis matter. In fact, they're often the first thing that separates innocent people from guilty ones. If you can prove you were somewhere else when a crime happened, you're off the hook. But if you can't, if your alibi is weak or non-existent or falls apart under scrutiny, you become interesting to investigators. This suspect didn't have a solid alibi. Or maybe he did initially. But when detectives checked it out, it didn't hold up. Someone said they were with him, but the timeline didn't match. He said he was home, but nobody could confirm it. He said he was at work, but his boss couldn't remember. Weak alibis are red flags. There may have been physical evidence connecting him to the scene. Not conclusive evidence, nothing like DNA or fingerprints that could definitively place him there, but something. Maybe fibers from his clothing, maybe dirt on his shoes that matched the area around the bridge, maybe scratches or injuries consistent with a struggle. In 1943, that kind of evidence was considered significant, even if it wouldn't meet today's standards for forensic proof. There may have been behavioral red flags. Did he act nervous when questioned? Did his story change? Did he avoid eye contact? Sweat profusely? Give answers that didn't make sense? Police officers are trained to read people, to spot the tells that indicate someone's lying. And in the 1,940 seconds, They relied heavily on that instinct because they didn't have technology to fall back on. If this guy was nervous, evasive, or contradictory during questioning, that would have raised suspicions. There might have been a connection to Naomi. Maybe they knew each other. Maybe he'd seen her walking home before and developed an obsession. Maybe he'd made advances that she rejected. Maybe there was bad blood between them that nobody knew about. Or maybe there was no connection at all. Maybe Naomi was simply a target of opportunity, in the wrong place at the wrong time. And this man decided to act on violent impulses. Either way, police had enough to bring him in, and when they did, they questioned him hard. Interrogations in the 1,940 seconds were a different beast than they are today. There were no recording devices documenting every word, no cameras capturing every expression, no lawyers sitting beside the suspect ensuring their rights were protected. It was just the cops and the suspect in a room, and the cops could lean on him as hard as they wanted. They could keep him there for hours. They could ask the same questions over and over, looking for inconsistencies. They could use psychological pressure, threats, promises, whatever it took to break him, and sometimes, innocent people break under that pressure. They confess to things they didn't do just to make it stop. That's a reality of interrogation psychology that we understand much better now than we did 80 years ago. So when we say police questioned the suspect, we don't know what that really means. We don't know what tactics they used. We don't know if he confessed or denied everything. We don't know if he asked for a lawyer, or if the concept of legal representation during questioning wasn't even on the table yet. All we know is that after the interrogation, police believed they had their man. But believing and proving are two different things. The prosecutors reviewed the evidence. They looked at what police had gathered, the witness statements, the physical evidence, the suspect's behavior, his lack of alibi, whatever he'd said during questioning, and they made a determination. It's not enough. Maybe the physical evidence was too circumstantial. Maybe the witnesses weren't credible enough. Maybe the suspect's statements, while suspicious, didn't amount to a confession. Maybe there were holes in the timeline that a defense attorney could exploit. Whatever the reason, the legal standard for charging someone with murder wasn't met. And here's the thing people don't always understand about the criminal justice system. Prosecutors don't just need evidence. They need overwhelming evidence. They need to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a high bar. If there's any reasonable explanation for the evidence that doesn't involve the suspect being guilty, a jury might acquit. And if that happens, you can never try that person again for the same crime. Double jeopardy. So prosecutors are cautious. They don't bring charges unless they're confident they can win. And in this case, they weren't confident. The suspect was released. Imagine being that guy for a second, and I know that's an uncomfortable thought. But stick with me. If you're guilty, you just got away with murder. You beat the system. You killed someone and walked free. The relief must have been overwhelming. But also, you'd have to live with that knowledge. You'd have to walk around knowing what you did, knowing that people suspect you, knowing that if you slip up even once, they might come for you again. If you're innocent, you've just been through hell. You've been accused of one of the worst crimes imaginable. You've been interrogated, held in custody, treated like a monster. Your name has been dragged through the mud. Everyone in town thinks you're a murderer. And even though you weren't charged, that cloud will hang over you for the rest of your life. Either scenario is heavy, but the suspect didn't carry that weight for long, because the war was still raging, and Uncle Sam needed soldiers. Whether this man volunteered or was drafted, we don't know. But at some point after his release, he ended up in uniform. He went through basic training. He was deployed overseas to one of the theaters of war, Europe or the Pacific. And there, thousands of miles from Sioux Falls, thousands of miles from the 12th Street Bridge where Naomi Chaney died, this man fought for his country. The same country Naomi had been serving when she was murdered. The irony is almost too much to bear. And then came the news that would seal Naomi's case as unsolved forever. The suspect was killed in action. Maybe it was a bullet. Maybe it was shrapnel from an artillery shell. Maybe it was a bombing raid or a naval battle or hand-to-hand combat in some jungle or on some beach whose name most Americans had never heard before. However it happened, he died. He was buried with military honors, probably. His family received a folded flag and a letter thanking them for his sacrifice. His name might be on a memorial somewhere, honored alongside thousands of other young men who gave their lives for freedom. He became a hero, or at least, he became indistinguishable from heroes, because in death, Everyone who falls in combat is honored. We don't litigate their past crimes or moral failings. We simply acknowledge their service and mourn their loss. But here's the question that haunts this case. Did a murderer die on that battlefield? Or did an innocent man? If he was guilty, if he really did kill Naomi Chaney, then justice was never served. He escaped prosecution. He escaped punishment. He died without ever answering for what he did. And Naomi's family was robbed of the closure that comes from seeing your loved one's killer face consequences. His death doesn't erase his crime. It just means the crime goes unpunished. But if he was innocent, if police had the wrong man, then the real killer was still out there, free, undetected, maybe laughing at how close they'd come to being caught, how lucky they were that police focused on someone else. And that means Naomi's killer lived out their days without ever facing justice. Maybe they died of old age, surrounded by family, never revealing what they'd done. Maybe they're the ones buried with honors, their secret taken to the grave. We'll never know. Because the one person who could answer these questions is dead. Whatever he knew, whatever truth he carried about that night in 1943 died with him on a battlefield in World War II. And that's where the investigation effectively ended. There were no other strong leads, no other suspects who rose to the level of being arrested. The case stayed open technically, but it wasn't active. It wasn't being worked. It was just there, a file in a cabinet, a cold case. Before people even used that term, the detectives who worked Naomi's case probably went to their graves frustrated, wondering if they'd had the right guy, wondering if they could have done something differently, wondering if justice would ever be served. Naomi's family went to their graves without answers, without closure, without ever knowing who killed their daughter and why. And Naomi herself, buried in whatever cemetery holds her remains, never got justice. 80 years later, nothing has changed. The suspect is dead. The witnesses are dead. The investigators are dead. Everyone connected to this case is gone, except the truth. That's still out there somewhere, buried in old records, hidden in family secrets, waiting to be uncovered. And that's what makes cold cases like this so important, because as long as we're telling these stories, as long as we're refusing to let victims like Naomi be forgotten, there's still a chance, however slim, that someone, somewhere, knows something. Maybe it's a deathbed confession passed down through a family. Maybe it's a diary hidden in an attic. Maybe it's a piece of evidence that's been sitting in an evidence locker for 80 years, waiting for modern technology to unlock its secrets. Justice might be delayed, but it doesn't have to be denied forever. War doesn't care about your past. It doesn't matter if you're a good person or a bad one. It doesn't matter if you're running from something or running toward something. It doesn't matter if you left behind unfinished business or unresolved crimes. When bullets start flying, when shells start falling, when the chaos of combat engulfs you, none of that matters. You're just another soldier trying to survive. And for the suspect in Naomi Chaney's murder, survival wasn't in the cards. The news would have reached Sioux Falls the same way it reached thousands of American towns during World War II: a telegram, a knock on the door, a military officer standing on the front porch with his hat in his hands and an expression that said everything before he even opened his mouth. "We regret to inform you." The suspect's family would have been devastated. Whatever else he may have been, whatever he may have done, he was their son, their brother, their loved one, and now he was gone, killed in action thousands of miles from home. His name would have been added to the growing list of Sioux Falls men who'd made the ultimate sacrifice, a list that was getting longer every day as the war ground on, consuming young lives like a machine that could never be satisfied. There might have been a memorial service, a eulogy praising his courage and sacrifice, a folded flag presented to his mother or widow, the playing of taps, the firing of rifles in salute, all the honors accorded to those who die serving their country. And maybe he deserved those honors. Maybe he was a good soldier. Maybe he fought bravely. Maybe he saved his buddies' lives before losing his own. Maybe in those final moments on some distant battlefield, he redeemed whatever sins he may have carried. Or maybe not. Maybe he died still carrying the weight of what he'd done to Naomi Chaney. Maybe in his final conscious moments, as life drained out of him, he thought about that night under the 12th Street Bridge. Maybe he felt regret. Maybe he felt nothing at all. We'll never know. And that's what makes this twist so absolutely devastating. Because when that telegram arrived in Sioux Falls, it didn't just announce the death of a soldier. It announced the death of Naomi Chaney's case. Think about what investigators must have felt when they heard the news. They'd had a suspect, a strong one. Someone they believed, maybe even knew in their gut, had killed Naomi. Someone they'd questioned, held, built a case against. Someone they'd had to release because the evidence wasn't quite strong enough. But someone they'd never stopped watching, never stopped investigating. And now he was dead. Any chance of getting new evidence? Gone. Any chance of him making a mistake, saying something incriminating, leading them to proof they'd missed? Gone. Any chance of advancing forensic science, allowing them to retest evidence and finally prove what they suspected? Pointless. Because even if they could prove it, there was nobody left to prosecute. The case was over. Not solved. Not closed with a conviction. Just over. Dead in the water. Because the person who could have answered for it was dead in the ground. The cruelty of the timing is almost poetic in its injustice. If the suspect had lived, if he'd come home from the war like millions of other American soldiers, maybe something would have changed. Maybe years later, someone would have come forward with new information. Maybe technology would have advanced enough to test old evidence. Maybe he would have confessed on his deathbed, unable to carry the secret any longer. But none of that could happen now. Death is the ultimate escape from justice. You can't put a dead man on trial. You can't question a dead man. You can't convict a dead man. He's beyond the reach of human justice, whatever that justice might have been. And if he was guilty, if he really did murder Naomi Chaney, then he got away with it. Completely. Totally. Forever. He walked free after questioning. He lived his life for however many months or years passed between his release and his deployment. He died with military honors. His family mourned him as a hero, and Naomi got nothing. No trial, no conviction, no closure for her family, no acknowledgement that justice had been served. Just a cold case file that would sit in a drawer for the next 80 years. That's injustice compounded by injustice. First, Naomi was murdered. Then, her killer escaped prosecution. Then, any chance of ever prosecuting him disappeared entirely. She was failed at every level. But here's the other possibility, and it's just as disturbing. What if he was innocent? What if police had the wrong guy? What if he was just someone who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, who couldn't prove his alibi, who acted nervous during questioning because innocent people get nervous too? What if the real killer watched all of this unfold, watched police arrest someone else, watched them focus all their energy on the wrong person, watched that person go off to war and die, and breathed a sigh of relief? Because if police had the wrong suspect, that means the real killer was never even on their radar. They were free, undetected, living their life in Sioux Falls or somewhere else, knowing they'd gotten away with murder, knowing that even if they wanted to confess, it wouldn't matter, because everyone already believed someone else did it. That person could have lived to a ripe old age, could have raised a family, could have become a pillar of the community, could have died peacefully in their sleep, surrounded by grandchildren who never knew the monster their beloved grandfather or grandmother really was, and the truth died with them, just like it died with the suspect on that battlefield. Either way, guilty suspect or innocent suspect, Naomi loses. Justice is denied, the truth is buried, and the case goes cold. Before we keep going, I'm curious, what's the weather like where you are today? Sunny, rainy, snowing? Drop it in the comments below. I know that seems random, but humor me. Because right now, wherever you are, whatever the weather's doing, you're alive. You're here. You've got a future stretching out ahead of you. Naomi Chaney had a future too. Until someone took it from her, and then the system failed her. And then the one person who might have been able to answer for it died before justice could be served. That's the cruel reality of some cold cases. Sometimes there's no resolution, no neat ending, no moment where the detective solves the puzzle and the killer is brought to justice. Sometimes the truth just disappears. It vanishes into the fog of time, buried with the people who knew it, lost in records that weren't kept or were destroyed, or are sitting in some basement archive that nobody's looked at in decades, and all we're left with are questions. Did the suspect do it? If he did, how does it feel knowing he escaped justice? If he didn't, who really killed Naomi Chaney? Is that person's name in the case file somewhere, overlooked by investigators who were so focused on their prime suspect that they missed the real killer? Or was this a stranger on stranger crime, random and unsolvable from the start? We don't know. We may never know. And that's what makes Naomi Chaney's story so tragic. It's not just that she was murdered. It's that her murder will probably never be solved. The passage of time has made it nearly impossible. But nearly impossible isn't the same as completely impossible. And that's why we're here. That's why we're telling this story. That's why it matters that you're watching this and sharing it and keeping Naomi's memory alive. Because as long as people are talking about this case, as long as people are asking questions, there's a chance, however small, that someone, somewhere, knows something. And maybe, just maybe, they'll finally speak up. After the suspect's death, something terrible happened to Naomi Chaney's case. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The investigation didn't continue with renewed vigor. There was no pivot to alternative suspects. No fresh leads emerged. The case just sat there, stagnant, forgotten, relegated to the back of a filing cabinet while detectives moved on to crimes they actually had a chance of solving. And slowly, inevitably, Naomi's story began to fade from public memory. That's how it happens with cold cases. They don't disappear all at once. It's a gradual erasure, like a photograph left out in the sun that loses its color bit by bit until you can barely make out what it used to show. First, people stop talking about it every day. Then they stop talking about it every week. Then it only comes up occasionally. Remember that soldier who was killed back in '43? Until eventually, even those conversations stop. New crimes happen. New tragedies demand attention. Life moves forward, and Naomi Chaney becomes a footnote. For her family, the pain never faded. Grief doesn't work that way. It doesn't diminish with time like people think it does. It just changes shape. It becomes something you learn to carry, rather than something that crushes you every moment of every day. But carrying grief without closure? That's a special kind of torture. Naomi's parents, her siblings, her extended family, they never got answers. They never got to sit in a courtroom and hear a jury say, guilty. They never got to look the person who killed their daughter in the eye and ask, why? They lived with questions that gnawed at them for the rest of their lives. Who did this? Why did this happen? Could it have been prevented? Did the police really have the right suspect? Or is Naomi's killer still out there somewhere? Those questions don't go away. They become background noise in your life, always humming, always present, never resolved. And as the years passed and Naomi's family members aged and eventually died themselves, they carried those questions to their graves. Every single person who loved Naomi Chaney died without knowing who killed her. Let that sink in for a moment. Her mother died not knowing. Her father died not knowing. Her siblings died not knowing. Every friend she ever had, every person who cared about her, they all died, with this mystery unsolved. That's not just tragic. That's a systematic failure of justice that spans generations. The community of Sioux Falls moved on faster than the family did, because that's what communities do. They have to. You can't sustain collective grief and fear indefinitely. By the late 1942, after the war ended, and soldiers came home, and life returned to some semblance of normalcy, Naomi's murder was already fading from daily conversation. It became that old case from the war years. Then it became that thing that happened a long time ago. Eventually, it became nothing. New residents moved to Sioux Falls who'd never heard of Naomi Chaney. Kids grew up not knowing a soldier had been murdered on their streets. The city expanded, neighborhoods changed, and the 12th Street Bridge became just another piece of infrastructure people crossed without thinking twice about. The bridge is still there, by the way. Still standing. Still spanning the Big Sioux River. Still carrying traffic from one side to the other, just like it did in 1943. But there's no marker, no plaque, no memorial, nothing to indicate that this is where a young woman serving her country was beaten to death and left in the darkness. People drive over it every day with no idea what happened there 80 years ago, and maybe that's the most haunting part of all. This place where something so terrible occurred has been absorbed back into the mundane fabric of everyday life. The horror has been paved over, literally and figuratively. The bridge keeps its secrets. Over the decades, there were occasional attempts to revisit the case. When new detectives came into the department, sometimes they'd pull the old files and take a look, hoping fresh eyes might spot something that was missed. They never did. In the 1,960 seconds and 70 seconds, as forensic science advanced, there might have been hopes that new techniques could be applied to old evidence. But by then, who knows what evidence still existed, or what condition it was in. Physical evidence degrades, chain of custody gets murky, items get lost or destroyed or misfiled. And even if you could test something, what would you test it against? The prime suspect was dead, without a living person to compare DNA or fingerprints to. What's the point? There were probably theories over the years. Alternative suspects whose names came up, leads that seemed promising for a moment before fizzling out. Maybe someone came forward claiming to know something, only for their story to fall apart under scrutiny. Maybe deathbed confessions were made that couldn't be corroborated. Maybe family members of the original suspect insisted he was innocent and pointed fingers elsewhere, but none of it led anywhere. None of it resulted in charges. None of it brought closure. None of it solved Naomi Chaney's murder. The case remained cold, and as the decades rolled by, the 1,950 seconds, 60 seconds, 70 seconds, 80 seconds, 90 seconds, 2000s, it became less a case and more a historical curiosity. The oldest unsolved murder in Sioux Falls history, a piece of local lore, a true crime story that older residents might mention when discussing the city's past, but not a priority. Not something actively being investigated. Not something anyone truly believed would ever be solved. By the time we reached the 2000s and 2010 seconds, everyone directly connected to the case was dead. The detectives who worked it, the witnesses who were interviewed, the family members who grieved, the suspect who may or may not have done it, all gone. The only things that remain are paper records, police reports, witness statements, evidence logs, whatever documents were filed away in 1943 and survived the intervening decades, and Naomi's grave, wherever it is. That's what happens when justice is delayed too long. It doesn't just fail the victim, it outlives everyone who could have provided it. But here's why Naomi's case matters, even 80 years later. Because she's not alone. There are thousands of cases just like hers across this country. Cold cases from decades ago where the victim has been forgotten, where the family is gone, where the trail is so cold it's frozen solid. Women who were murdered and whose killers were never caught. Soldiers who served their country only to be killed by one of their own citizens. Young people with their whole lives ahead of them, snuffed out by violence and failed by a system that couldn't or wouldn't bring them justice. Every single one of them deserves to be remembered. Every single one of them matters. Naomi Chaney wasn't just a statistic. She wasn't just a cold case number. She was a person, a daughter, a sister, a patriot, a woman who volunteered to serve when her country called. And her story deserves to be told. Because when we forget these victims, when we let their stories fade into obscurity, we're complicit in their erasure. We're saying their lives didn't matter enough to remember. We're saying the injustice done to them doesn't matter anymore. But it does matter. It matters that Naomi never got justice. It matters that her family died without answers. It matters that whoever killed her, whether it was the suspect or someone else, never faced consequences. And it matters that we're here, right now, talking about her, saying her name, refusing to let her be forgotten. That might not sound like much. It might not feel like justice, but it's something. It's bearing witness. It's saying, we see you, Naomi. We remember you. Your life mattered. Your death mattered. And the fact that your killer was never caught matters too. In a world that's constantly moving forward, constantly chasing the next headline, constantly forgetting yesterday's news, remembering is an act of resistance. Remembering is how we honor the dead. And maybe, just maybe, remembering is how we finally get justice. Because cold cases do get solved sometimes. Evidence that's been sitting in storage for decades gets retested with new technology. DNA databases get searched. Genetic genealogy cracks cases that seemed impossible. Someone's conscience finally gets to them and they confess. It happens, not often enough. Not as much as we'd like. But it happens. And as long as there's a chance, any chance at all, that Naomi Chaney's case could be one of those miracle solves, we have an obligation to keep telling her story, to keep asking questions, to keep demanding that someone, somewhere, look at this case with fresh eyes and modern tools, and see if there's anything that was missed. Because Naomi deserves that much. She served her country. She gave everything. And in return, her country failed her. The least we can do is remember. The least we can do is refuse to let her story die. The least we can do is keep fighting for justice, even if it comes 80 years too late. Here's the question that keeps me up at night. Could Naomi Chaney's case be solved today? Not in 1943 when forensic science was primitive. Not in 1963 or 1983 when the case was already decades old and everyone involved was either dead or dying. But now, in 2024, with everything we know, everything we can do, all the technology we have at our fingertips, could this case finally be cracked? The answer is complicated. Let's start with what modern forensics can do that 1,940 seconds investigators could only dream about. DNA analysis has revolutionized criminal investigations. A single hair, a drop of blood, a microscopic fiber, that's all it takes now. We can extract DNA from evidence that's decades old, sometimes even a century old, as long as it's been stored properly. And we're not just talking about matching DNA to a suspect you already have in custody. We're talking about forensic genealogy, the technique that caught the Golden State Killer after 40 years. Here's how it works. You take DNA from a crime scene, upload it to genealogy databases, where millions of people have voluntarily submitted their DNA for ancestry testing, and you build a family tree. You find distant cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins twice removed, and then you work backward, narrowing down the branches of that family tree until you identify a suspect who was in the right place at the right time. It's detective work on steroids, and it solved dozens of cold cases that were considered hopeless. Could it work for Naomi? Maybe. But there's a big if attached to that maybe. It only works if there's usable DNA evidence from the crime scene, and it only works if that evidence has been preserved properly for 80 years. That's a massive question mark. In 1943, nobody was thinking about DNA preservation because nobody knew DNA was the key to solving crimes. The structure of DNA wasn't even discovered until 1953, 10 years after Naomi died. DNA profiling wasn't developed until 1984, so when evidence was collected from the scene of Naomi's murder, it wasn't handled with DNA preservation in mind. It wasn't stored in climate-controlled facilities with chain-of-custody protocols. It was just stored. However, police departments stored evidence in the 1,940 seconds, which probably meant a box in a basement or an evidence room with no temperature control. Evidence degrades over time. Biological material breaks down. Paper deteriorates. Items get moved, misplaced, thrown out during office cleanings or department reorganizations. The odds that usable DNA evidence from Naomi's case still exists, honestly, they're not great, but they're not zero. Some police departments have incredible archives. Some evidence has survived decades in surprisingly good condition, and it only takes one viable sample, one hair, one drop of blood, one fiber with touch DNA on it to potentially crack this case wide open. So the first question is, does any physical evidence from Naomi's murder still exist? And if so, where is it? Is it sitting in the Sioux Falls Police Department evidence room, labeled and cataloged? Or was it destroyed years ago during a purge of old files? Was it lost in a flood or a fire? Was it transferred to a different facility? Did someone literally throw it away because nobody's going to solve a case from 1,943? I don't know the answer to that. And unfortunately, unless someone with access to the department's records goes looking, we may never know. But let's say the evidence exists. Let's say there's a box somewhere labeled Cheney, Naomi, 1,943, with items from the crime scene. What would investigators do with it today? First, they'd re-examine everything with modern eyes. Crime scene photos would be analyzed using current forensic techniques. Evidence would be retested using technology that didn't exist when it was first collected. If there's any biological material, blood, hair, skin cells, anything, they'd extract DNA and run it through CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system. That's a database of DNA profiles from convicted offenders, arrestees, and unsolved crime scenes. If the killer was ever arrested for another crime and had their DNA collected, there'd be a match. Case solved. But remember, the prime suspect died in World War II. His DNA isn't in any database, so even if crime scene DNA exists, there's nobody to match it to. Unless they can find living relatives of the suspect. Children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews. DNA is inherited, and while you won't get an exact match from a relative, you'll get enough genetic markers to establish familial connection. That's where forensic genealogy comes in. That's where you build the family tree, and work backward to identify who the DNA belongs to. It's painstaking work. It takes months, sometimes years. It requires genealogists who can navigate old census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, obituaries. It requires DNA from multiple family members to triangulate and confirm, but it works. It's worked dozens of times. And it could work here. If, and this is a huge if, the evidence exists, is testable, and contains usable DNA. That's a lot of ifs. But there are other possibilities too. Cold case investigations aren't just about DNA. They're about re-examining everything with fresh perspective. Modern detectives might look at the witness statements and notice something the original investigators missed. They might identify alternative suspects who weren't seriously considered in 1943. They might use geographic profiling to narrow down where the killer likely lived or worked. They might reach out to the public exactly what we're doing right now and hope that someone, somewhere has information that was never reported. Maybe it's a family secret. Maybe someone's grandfather confessed on his deathbed and the family never told anyone. Maybe there's a diary in someone's attic, a letter hidden in a box of old papers, a piece of information that's been sitting dormant for 80 years waiting to be discovered. Cold cases get solved when people come forward. When someone finally decides to speak up about something they've known for years, but never had the courage to share. That's why telling these stories matters. Because you never know who's watching. You never know who might recognize a name, a location, a detail that triggers a memory or a family story they'd heard years ago. So let me ask you directly. Do you think this case could still be solved? What do you think happened that night? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear what you're thinking. Here's the reality. Sioux Falls Police Department has listed Naomi Chaney's murder as the oldest unsolved case in the city's history. That designation means they acknowledge it. They know it exists. But whether it's being actively investigated, whether anyone is actually working on it, that's a different question. Cold cases require resources. They require detectives who have time to dedicate to cases that might never be solved. They require budgets for DNA testing, forensic analysis, investigative travel, and most police departments are stretched thin, dealing with current crimes. They don't have the luxury of assigning full-time detectives to 80-year-old murders, so Naomi's case sits, waiting, hoping, gathering more dust with each passing year. But here's what gives me hope. Every year, technology gets better. Every year, DNA databases get larger. Every year, genealogical records become more accessible. And every year, there's a chance that someone, somewhere, will take a fresh look at Naomi Chaney's case and see something that's been hiding in plain sight for 8 decades. The race against time is real. Evidence continues to degrade. People who might have secondhand knowledge continue to age and die. But we're not out of time yet. Not quite. Justice for Naomi is still possible. Unlikely? Maybe. Impossible? Absolutely not. Let me tell you why this case matters so much to me. And I'm not just talking about the true crime aspect of it, the mystery, the unsolved questions, the twist of the suspect dying before trial. That's all compelling, sure, but that's not why Naomi Chaney's story keeps me up at night. It's what her case represents. It's about every person who served their country and got nothing in return but betrayal. It's about every woman whose contributions were erased from history. It's about every victim whose case went cold because they weren't important enough, weren't wealthy enough, weren't connected enough to matter. Naomi Chaney was all of those things. She was a woman in 1943 who broke barriers to serve in the military. At a time when society told women their place was in the home, Naomi said no and put on a uniform. She volunteered. She stepped up. She did her part to help win a war that threatened everything America stood for. And what did she get for it? She got murdered on American soil while men were dying on foreign battlefields. She got an investigation that couldn't build a strong enough case. She got a suspect who died before trial. She got 80 years of being forgotten. That's not just injustice. That's erasure. Women's contributions to World War II have been systematically undervalued and forgotten. We remember the soldiers who stormed the beaches. We remember the pilots who flew bombing missions. We remember the generals who planned the strategies. But the women, the ones who built the planes and tanks, the ones who worked as code breakers and radio operators, the ones who freed up men to fight by taking on roles they'd been told they couldn't handle, they've been footnotes, afterthoughts, barely mentioned in history books. And women like Naomi, women who served and were murdered for it, they're not even footnotes. They're ghosts. Erased completely from the narrative. That needs to change. Naomi's service mattered. Her sacrifice mattered. And her death should have mattered enough for someone to solve her damn case. But it didn't. And that tells you everything you need to know about how we value certain lives over others. If Naomi had been a male officer murdered on base, would the case have been pursued more aggressively? Would more resources have been thrown at it? Would it have made national news instead of being buried in local police files? I think we both know the answer to that. Women's lives, especially in the 1,940 seconds, weren't valued the same way men's were. And women who stepped outside traditional roles, women who dared to wear uniforms and do men's work, they were respected by some, but they were also resented by others. There were people who thought women didn't belong in the military, people who thought they were asking for trouble by taking on non-traditional roles, people who might have seen Naomi's murder as somehow less tragic because she'd put herself in harm's way by joining the WAC. That's victim blaming, and it's disgusting. Naomi didn't deserve what happened to her. She deserved to come home safely every night. She deserved to finish her service and return to civilian life and live out the decades she had ahead of her. And when someone took that from her, she deserved justice. She still does. That's why telling these stories is so important. Because when we talk about cold cases, we're not just talking about puzzles to be solved or mysteries to be unraveled. We're talking about people, people who were loved, people who had dreams and plans and futures that were stolen from them, people whose families never got closure, people who deserve to be remembered as more than just victims. Naomi Chaney was a patriot. She was brave. She was a barrier breaker. She was someone who answered her country's call when so many others could have looked the away. And for 80 years, we've let her be forgotten. That ends now, because as long as we're telling her story, she's not forgotten. As long as we're demanding justice, her case isn't closed. As long as we're refusing to let her be another anonymous cold case file, she matters. And she's not the only one. There are thousands of cases like hers, thousands of victims who've been forgotten, thousands of families who never got answers, thousands of killers who got away with murder because the case went cold and nobody cared enough to keep fighting. Every single one of them deserves what we're doing right here, right now. They deserve to have their stories told. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve for people to care, even decades after their deaths. That's what this channel is about. That's what this community is about. And I need your help to make it happen. Listen, I know YouTube can be a wild place, but this community we're building here, it matters. If you believe stories like Naomi's deserve to be told, subscribe and share this video. Let's be the ones who refuse to forget. Hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below with your thoughts. Become part of a community that gives voices to the voiceless. Because justice might be delayed, but it doesn't have to be denied forever. And remembering, simply remembering, is the first step toward justice. Naomi Chaney deserves that. Every forgotten victim deserves that. And together, we can make sure they get it. So what do you say? Are you with me? Are you ready to refuse to forget? Because Naomi's story isn't over yet. Not by a long shot. And neither is our fight for justice. 80 years. That's how long Naomi Chaney has been waiting for justice. 80 years since she walked home from the base for the last time. 80 years since someone attacked her near the 12th Street Bridge. 80 years since her body was discovered, still wearing the uniform that represented everything noble about service and sacrifice. 80 years of silence. 80 years of unanswered questions. 80 years of a killer never being held accountable. Think about what 80 years means. It's longer than most human lifespans. It's entire generations born, living full lives, and dying without ever knowing Naomi's name. It's technology advancing from radio broadcasts to smartphones, from telegrams to instant global communication, from primitive forensics to DNA analysis that can identify someone from a single cell. The world has changed completely since 1943, but one thing hasn't changed. Naomi Chaney still hasn't gotten justice, and that's unacceptable. She deserved better than what she got. She deserved to finish her service and return home to her family. She deserved to live the life she'd barely begun. She deserved to see the end of the war she was helping to fight. She deserved to grow old, to build a family, to tell her grandchildren stories about the time she wore a uniform and served her country. Instead, she got a brutal death and a forgotten cold case. Her family deserved better too. They deserved answers. They deserved closure. They deserved to see the person who killed their daughter face a jury and answer for what they'd done. Instead, they got decades of wondering, decades of pain without resolution, and eventually, they all died, still wondering, still hurting, still hoping that someday, somehow, someone would solve this case. That didn't happen, but it still could. Because here's what I believe. The truth always wants to come out. It might take time, decades, even centuries, but truth has a way of surfacing. Secrets get too heavy to carry. Deathbed confessions get made. Documents get discovered. Evidence gets retested. And sometimes, all it takes is the right person, hearing the right story, at the right time. Maybe that person is watching this video right now. Maybe you know something. Maybe your grandfather told you a story that never quite made sense. Maybe you found letters in your family's attic that mentioned Sioux Falls in 1943. Maybe you heard whispers growing up about a relative who came back from the war different, haunted, carrying guilt about something that happened before he shipped out. If that's you, if you know anything, suspect anything, have any information at all about what happened to Naomi Chaney, please come forward. Contact the Sioux Falls Police Department. Contact a true crime podcast. Hell, leave a comment on this video. Just don't stay silent, because your information, no matter how small it might seem, could be the piece that finally solves this 80-year-old puzzle. It could be the key that finally brings justice to Naomi. And even if you don't have information, you can still help. You can share this video. You can tell Naomi's story to people you know. You can refuse to let her be forgotten, because that's the real tragedy of cold cases, not just that they go unsolved, but that the victims get forgotten. Their names disappear. Their stories fade, and eventually, it's like they never existed at all. We can't let that happen to Naomi. She existed. She mattered. She served. She sacrificed. And she deserves to be remembered. The 12th Street Bridge is still standing in Sioux Falls. Cars still drive over it every day. People still walk across it, probably never knowing that it's a crime scene, that it's the last place a young soldier took her final breaths. Maybe someday there will be a memorial there, a plaque with Naomi's name on it, a recognition that something terrible happened in that spot, and the person responsible was never brought to justice. Maybe someday her case will be solved and her killer, or the truth about her killer, will finally be revealed. Maybe someday someone will care enough to look at that dusty old file with fresh eyes and modern technology and see what 1,940 seconds investigators couldn't see. Maybe that someday is today. Maybe it starts with you watching this video and deciding that Naomi Chaney's story deserves to be heard. Before you go, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Share this video. Comment below with your thoughts. And if you know anything about Naomi Chaney's case, reach out. Justice may be delayed, but it doesn't have to be denied forever. Tell me in the comments, do you think this case could still be solved? What do you think happened that night? Because I'm not giving up on Naomi. I'm not letting her be forgotten, and I don't think you will either. Naomi Chaney was a soldier, a patriot, a woman who volunteered to serve her country during its darkest hour. She's been waiting 80 years for justice. Let's not make her wait any longer. This is her story. And it's not over yet. Remember her name, Naomi Irene Chaney. She deserves that much. She deserves everything.